Hi, thanks so much for joining us for Gray Barn Rising. Sitting here with Bootsy Beagle, who's taking a little nap, and of course drinking a cup of tea, but I'm reading the poems this evening of one of my very favorite poets, Yannis Ritsos. Yannis Ritsos, I mentioned him briefly in another broadcast on Tom McGrath, and promised you I'd be giving a reading of Ritsos, and I'm indeed going to do that this evening. He's a Greek poet who was born in 1909, and he left the body in 1990. I probably have, I'm going to guess here, at least 25 books of Yannis Ritsos. He was one of the most prolific of the Greek poets of that period, and such a profound poet, although most of his poems are very short and brief and often write about disembodied figures and characters who are dislocated. Part of that vision comes from his years of political oppression. He was very left-leaning in his communist politics, and he suffered a great deal for that, in and out of detention camps, being placed in exile on various Greek islands, even under house arrest. We have a couple of periods of Greek fascism during his lifetime. We have the Metaxas regime in the 30s, which was a military coup by General Metaxas and his associates. And then later we have, in the late 60s, another military coup in Greece that was derisively called by the leftist Greeks the colonels, in reference again to the generals of the 30s, even though many of the members of the military coup of the late 60s were generals, but they called them the colonels. And Ritsos suffered because of oppression of his political beliefs and because of the turmoil of the politics in Greece at the time. But his poems remain masterworks of intelligence in which he comments politically, but also intensely psychologically about what happens to people under that kind of political oppression. I'm going to be reading this evening from a few books. I want to start by reading from Subterranean Horses, which is a book that's translated by Minas Savas, and I guess I'll just go ahead and begin reading and share a couple of these poems with you. I think what you're going to hear is sort of these moments of people trying to connect and perhaps not connecting. Actually, let me begin with this poem, and then I'll return to this poem. This is called Because. Because the buses were idle before the fence. Because the mannequins gesticulated in the lighted shop windows. Because the girl with the bicycle procrastinated before the pharmacy. Because the woodsman smashed the glass door of the beer tavern. Because the boy with the stolen pencil was alone in the elevator. Because the dogs had been abandoned next to the seaside villas. Because the rusty grater was covered by the nettles. Because the sky was ashen with a scarlet fish. Because the horse on the mountain was more alone than the star. Because both they and these others were hunted. For this, only for this reason, I lied to you. That's one of those incredibly startling endings. And Ritsos will do that often in his poems. Here's the poem I was going to start with and want to read now. It's called So, with a question mark. So. And it begins with a piece of dialogue. You would have been more sincere, of course, if you had died. If you had... She did not continue. She watched him undress, as usual, pulling off his clothing, piece by piece. When he was completely naked, he crossed the room, wound the alarm clock, walked into the kitchen and returned with a glass of water. Still naked, he placed the glass on the dresser. He smiled. So? he said only, "So," and he dipped one finger in the glass. As you can hear in that Ritsos poem, you're going to get this intense moment, and it's almost like a work of drama. You get this intense moment, and often these characters are in this incredibly dramatic situation and sometimes disembodied, so that sometimes Ritsos is commenting on psychological complexities and isolation by virtue of the disconnect between characters. He does it in other ways as well, but certainly he does that in that poem. This is a poem titled Brief Dialogue, and this is from another collection called Ritsos in Parentheses, translated by a remarkable translator of Greek poetry, Edmund Keeley, who's translated many Greek poets, including George Zephyrus, Odysseus Elitis, and others of this particular generation of Greek poetry. Brief Dialogue. The sky burned desolate behind the houses. "Why are you crying?" he asked, buckling his belt. "The world is beautiful," she answered. "So beautiful, with such an awful headache. And the bed is a silent, fierce animal getting ready to leave." Even the title talks about dialogue and brevity, and I think that's part of what's happening in the Ritsos poems. Things get cut off and almost completed, and yet there is this great implication because of what's left unsaid, what's left out. I want to read now from my very favorite work of Yannis Ritsos, and probably one of the best book titles I've ever come across, and that's Scripture of the Blind. This is an incredible book translated by another great Greek translator, Kaiman Fryer, who's also translated some of the Greek poets I just mentioned a bit ago. And this book was written in 1972 in the wake of the military coup that the colonels had in Greece at the time. So he was, I believe, under house arrest at the time that he wrote these poems. He wrote this entire book during a 2-month period, from late September into November. And these poems are really incredible. So I'm going to read a few poems from Scripture of the Blind. This is called Meaningless Exception. This was written in Athens in October 5th, 1972. Irresolute feelings, movements, events. The evening was the color of yellow, like a glass of lemonade, drunk by the blind man before the window. He didn't know where he should step, on the rug, on the tiles. I told him, "You too will die." He didn't believe me. Women now age abruptly. They don't see well. Seated on a bed, they pierce their fingers with a large needle as they mend a very long dyed army coat. They stand up, sucking their fingers, bewildered, looking at the chair, at the curtain, for an explanation. They even lose the needle, are afraid lest it pierce into their thighs, their sleep. Only I, who have known this long before, he says, only I am young. Bloodletting. His behavior was all one gesture to drive away the big fly that doggedly kept returning to the same spot, to his temple, to his cheek, to his nose. At last he stood still. The fly also stood still on his cheek, where it sucked his blood and grew larger. In his place, only the fly remained, it too wrapped round by the spider's cobweb, where droplets of moisture glittered. That poem was written November 1st, 1972, also in Athens. You know, some of these poems in Scripture of the Blind almost seem like little miniature paintings or even snapshots, photographs that capture this brief but intense moment. The Dark Shop. This was written in Kalamos, November 12, 1972. The shop was dark. Two soldiers were buying cigarettes. In the right corner in the back stood a weighing machine. A shadowy woman got on the machine to weigh herself. The soldiers watched. The pointer did not move. Perhaps the weighing machine was out of order, or probably the numbers could not be seen in the dark. It was most likely, however, that the woman weighed nothing at all. Nevertheless, as she was innocently raising one of her hands, 2 bottles of beer fell from the shelf, broke on the tiles, and wet her feet. Scripture of the Blind continues on like that, and there's many poems that just capture, again, this disembodiment, this lack of communication, this sense where one thing happens, one action happens, and then there's sort of a result, like in that moment, the bottles of beer fall on the ground. This is, I would get all of these Ritsos books, but Scripture of the Blind I would run out and get tomorrow if you possibly could. And I want to read a few of his haiku-like poems, although they're not haiku. 3 by 111 tristiches, and this is from a small Greek publishing house, Pella. And I just want to read a couple. They're very aphoristic, and I would like you to have a sense of Ritsos's vision that is speaks less of annihilation and less of lack of connection. And so I want to close. I'm just going to pick a few of these at random and read. I won't give you the dates or the numbers. Unbuttoned shirt, Sunday of the 9 trees, hold him, he will fly. With the feet of the ants, inch by inch you study the earth, down to the underworld. Farmers and fishermen on the bare shore, a sheep leans over the basket, smells the fish. Stains, stains, nothing, oath secret kept, poem. Under your skin, how many birds, when I touch you, they sing all together. The hunters lay down in the woods. 5 nightingales lulled them to sleep. A cuckoo woke them. In an insect's translucent wing, I studied the geography of art. I hope that this sampling of poems that I've chosen for you this evening will give you motivation to seek out the work of Yannis Ritsos. As I said, he's incredibly prolific, one of the most prolific of the Greek modern poets who I know of. And again, I read, again from that, this book from the Greek press, 3 by 111 tristiches, Scripture of the Blind, Ritsos in parentheses, and Subterranean Horses. And there's many more books by Yannis Ritsos out there, and I hope that you will seek his work out and enjoy it as much as I